Okay, as you might have just heard, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared to our YouTube channel. I will share that information shortly, but just wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. I am going to go ahead and share my screen just to get us started. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really pleased to introduce John Jones and Emily Hastings for this month's Your Hour with APA Virginia, which is sponsored by the Berkeley Group. We will be having mapping suitability for suburban agriculture and planning local food systems. So I think we have a really great and informative webinar ahead of us. I will be sharing helpful links to our chapter's YouTube, as I mentioned, and our website shortly, so keep your eyes peeled on the chat box. We really do encourage questions. Please submit your questions, though, using the Q&A feature as opposed to the chat box. This will just help our panelists, or our speakers, excuse me, keep track of all inquiries. You can also use the raise hand feature during the Q&A portion to request to be unmuted if you'd prefer to ask your question that way. So I'm going to hand over screen sharing capabilities. And in the meantime, I'm going to introduce our speakers a little bit further, but thank you everyone for joining us. And alrighty, Emily, you should be good to go to share, and I'm going to introduce you both. So John C. Jones is an assistant professor in the Center for Environmental Studies and a funded faculty member of Institute of Inclusion, Inquiry, and Innovation, also known as I-Cubed, at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. His main research interests surround the intersection of urban food system development, urban food insecurity, local governance, and the challenges facing America's post-industrial cities in a globalizing world. He draws upon his practitioner experience in government and politics at the local and state levels in Ohio and New Jersey to inform his work. His scholarship is available to the public through his website, cultivatingcities.com. I will also share that link in the chat shortly. He holds a PhD in urban systems from Rutgers University and the New Jersey Institute of Technology, as well as an MPA and a BA in political science from the University of Dayton. We also have Emily Hastings, who is a geospatial research analyst at the Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her geospatial research focuses on the intersection of urban food systems, urban planning, climate change, and equity analysis. She draws on her experience in organic agriculture production in urban and rural spaces, with her experience conducting analyses for local government across the Commonwealth to inform her work. She holds an MS degree in environmental studies with a focus in geographic information systems from Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as a bachelor's degree in environmental science and landscape agriculture from the University of Virginia. So we have two really great speakers with us today, and I'm excited for this webinar. And attendees, please feel free to reach out in the chat box if you have any logistical questions, but otherwise submit your questions using the Q&A box, and we will go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Jillian. I really appreciate that. And so we're going to talk for about 45 minutes or so here, I think, and then we're going to take some questions at the end. If you want to post in Q&A, we can try to respond potentially during the presentation, but that's a little bit logistically hard. But we'll do our best. And thanks for the introduction. That was great. Just a slight bit of background on me, how I came to this, to be interested in urban food systems. I used to do economic development for the state of Ohio, in the western part of Ohio, where I'm from, where there used to be a lot of automobile parts manufacturing. But because of deindustrialization and changes in technology and globalization and a whole bunch of isms, there's a lot of what I prefer to use the term underutilized land in Western Ohio. And about 12 years ago or so now, 13 years ago, I ran into folks from Ohio State Extension, which is very similar to Virginia Tech or Virginia State Extension, doing community gardening programming in my hometown. And I became fascinated by the idea of gardening and to a larger extent food systems and food production coming back into urban spaces and putting some of those spaces back into use, not necessarily all of them, obviously, but definitely some of them. And so here we are 13 years later, and we're presenting on some of the research that Emily and I have been doing about urban food systems planning. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Emily. So food systems and planning for food systems in the planning profession has a odd history. At the very beginning of the planning profession, there was a thought that maybe planners needed to be involved in food systems planning, and then that kind of fell away for most of the 20th century. So I wish that we could do a poll. Jillian, I don't know if you can do this or not, but I'm curious for everyone out there, have you heard of Ebenezer Howard's ideas on the garden city? So I don't know if anybody wants to throw that in the chat or throw in the Q&A or something like that, but I'm curious how many people have heard of Ebenezer Howard. But during the height of the Victorian city, when we have lots and lots of people piling into into cities from the rural areas as the Industrial Revolution is going on, there's a desire to focus on the health of the people that are moving into those cities, or the health of the people that are moving into the cities. And Howard is the first kind of to suggest the idea that it looks like there's a lot of people that have heard of Howard. So okay, maybe this is repeating some information for you. But there's a desire to say there's a lot of negative health consequences of the design of the Victorian city, and that we need to try to have food systems planning within that. And so, and Emily, I guess go ahead and move on to the next slide, because I think that captures slightly better here. You can see this radial design that Howard proposes for England in the late 1890s. And the idea that we have this intermodal rail transportation connecting these communities, but food systems are inherently built into this, in that there's kind of large farms in between the urban centers, and then there's also what the British call allotment gardening, but what we would think of be community gardening, kind of built on the periphery of these kind of small towns that kind of radiate out from the central city. And I think that is a very innovative idea, and I wish that we had seen that either in Europe or here in the United States. It's a little bit more common. Some of the ideas were taken by some countries in Europe, but not so much here in the United States, unfortunately. And there's the desire to link our regional land use, economic development, public health, food systems, transportation, environment. I think that's kind of what Howard was trying to get at, but unfortunately, due to both the urban-rural divide, the narrative that cities and rural spaces are inherently different, that was advanced by some urban sociologists from the School of Chicago in the 1920s, and that had a lot of influence on planning development throughout the rest of the 20th century. That urban-rural divide is a very powerful thing that I think that we still see here today. When we talk about planning for food systems in the 21st century, there's still this urban versus rural. Oh yeah, and I guess a reminder from Jillian, please, if you can, there's a poll out there. Where are you joining from? It'd be really great if you could sign on to that so that we can see. And I even got the poll, so I'll say Central Virginia. Nope, I can't click on it. Okay, I don't know why that popped up for me. Anyway, so simultaneously with that urban-rural divide, there's also a significant growth in the industrialization of the food system. So think of, and I wish we had some slides about this, but we don't have time for it, but think in the pre-industrial city, most, not all, but a good chunk of where the food for a region or a city is going to be coming from the hinterlands or the periphery of that city. But as the world becomes more and more globalized and industrialized, and there's kind of waves of globalization and waves of industrialization that occur, but as those two processes are occurring, the food systems become more and more linked with each other, and there's a desire to kind of make the food systems more invisible. What I like to talk about in class with my students is the idea that you can pick up your phone and hit a couple buttons and food magically appears at your door via DoorDash. That is only maybe kings and emperors and queens and empresses throughout most of human civilization could have the ability to just kind of ring a bell and then food just kind of appears. But here in 2021, or here in the 21st century, we have the ability, everybody basically can do that. And that is a result of largely capitalism trying to make the food system invisible for the vast majority of people. We don't really think about where our food comes from. And there's a lot of economic reasons why that's the case. But we as planners haven't really spent that much time trying to focus on that because we were kind of deferring, and Emily, you can go to the next slide. In some ways, we were deferring to, I guess, go one slide back. We were deferring in some ways to food processors, food retailers, farmers, public health professionals to kind of figure out how we want the food system to be oriented. And I think that kind of goes back to that urban-rural divide issue as well, is that for a long time, planners didn't see food as something that we needed to plan for. That was kind of a rural thing. That we didn't really necessarily need to focus on. And so in a lot of ways, that system becomes invisible in the context of the city. There's a class that I teach in the fall semester, so I'm teaching it right now, where I force my students to kind of think about different ways about how the food system in an urban context is invisible. Because it's, as I kind of mentioned with the DoorDash example, it's a really powerful thing. It's a very convenience driven phenomenon that the capitalism wants it to be invisible. And in some ways, that's a really powerful thing. But we as planners, we probably could take a little bit more of an active role, and that's kind of what we're talking about here today. Next slide, Emily. So recently, within the last 20-ish years or so, American Planning Association has been challenged by Kaufman and Bailke and Kami Pothakuchi, 3 scholars of urban food systems, to kind of say, hey, planning profession, you need to kind of get your act in gear and try to figure out what role the planning profession should have as it relates to food systems. And so for the last 20-ish years or so, there's been a focus on kind of mixed use forms of urban agriculture that you kind of see in pockets around cities and around the country. But then also you've probably seen this kind of desire to focus on access issues. So when we talk about food deserts or food swamps, we're trying to map if people have access to grocery stores or not. We're not necessarily focused on, can they afford to go to Whole Foods, but is there a Whole Foods or another full service grocery store nearby? Thankfully, in some of the work that I've done in post-industrial communities, we're starting to see a movement towards a recognition of, hey, there's these vacant or underutilized or abandoned spaces due to deindustrialization that could be used in a food systems lens. And some planners, thankfully, are trying to kind of think about how we can change some of our regulatory and rule-based frameworks to try to make that a little bit easier for gardeners and farmers to go into those spaces. Next slide. But also the design of what urban agriculture is still changing. It's still quite speculative. We have on the previous slide, that's really kind of like an in-ground example. So, growing vegetables in the ground. But here I got pictures of Brooklyn Grange in New York City, and then Arrow Farms, which is in Newark, New Jersey. And these are 2 examples of urban agriculture in spaces where we wouldn't traditionally think you can grow vegetables, on the rooftop of a farm or on the rooftop of an old Navy Yard building in the case of the top image. And then the bottom image, that's an old, I forget the exact nature of the industrial building that it was, but it was a paintball factory a paintball shooting range for a number of years after it was a factory, and then it became a lettuce factory, or at least a lettuce farm or factory, depending on how you want to conceptualize that in your brain. But that's the technology that allows for this is very new, and we're still trying to figure out what exactly this means, because I think that there's a lot of future in taking over some post-industrial spaces like former factory buildings and putting in like what you see on the image below there. Now, that's not exactly what we're talking about today, but in a broad system sense, that's something that we need to be thinking about as planners. And Emily and I, we're geospatial planners. We use GIS to try to plan for in-ground urban agriculture, that's mostly what we're talking about here today. But GIS is a really powerful tool that can be used for food systems planning, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a second. Next slide, Emily. I think I'm turning over to you, right? Yeah. So now I'm turning over to Emily.
So we're going to start to talk about kind of our methodology and our research and kind of the history surrounding it. So basically what we want to do with our research is look at overall agricultural suitability. So it's not just looking at kind of the site level. We're starting to go broader. We're starting to take a broad approach using GIS to find the most suitable places for urban or suburban agriculture, specifically right now within the Greater Richmond region. So because we're taking this broad approach and we want, these sites to succeed, they can potentially function as green infrastructure and, contribute to the food system way into the future, because we are taking this approach and they will be suitable for agriculture into the future. So ULISA, or Urban Land Evaluation and Site Assessment, allows for this analyses and GIS to find these suitable areas. And ULISA emulates a traditionally rural agricultural planning tool called LISA, or Land Evaluation and Site Assessment. And it was first developed by the Soil Conservation Service, which turned into the NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And fortunately, because we utilize a very similar framework to the traditional LISA, our methodology could potentially open up federal conservation funding that was once kind of stuck within the rural space. Now we can potentially open it up for the urban space because they have very similar methodologies. So there's a process that ULISA takes that is very similar to traditional LISA. So first we start, with networking and working with our local partners to identify variables and available data sources within that locality. So we work with them to try and see what their priorities are, and we integrate those into our model. Then the next step is weighting those variables, which is part of traditional LISA. So we sit down with a locality and we see what variables are the most important to that locality. So it could be being, for example, like food access, like that variable that we create for them, it might be really important to them, making sure that the places that have low food access are not very close to a grocery store would be prioritized within our model. So it's a way to really emphasize what the locality is interested in and kind of point the model in that direction. Then we finally run the model to determine a % suitability score for agriculture. So that'll just immediately show the areas that are very good, very suitable for agricultural activities. And then on the back end, we really like to integrate that into the parcel layer so that we can really pull out different characteristics. We can see, for example, we worked with Chesterfield County. We can see which park scored very highly and what specific areas of those parks scored very highly, so that Parks and Rec, they can look at those and consider putting urban gardens or farms within a park, for example. And then even further on the back end, we can conduct individual site assessments to make sure that our kind of broad aerial approach, we go on the ground and make sure that it actually makes sense, because there's only but so much you can do within GIS. There's only but so much GIS can pick up. So you have to visit sites to make sure that they're actually suitable. And within, you'll see our raster squares. It's a pretty large area. So you can go within where that kind of raster cell was within GIS, and you can see the best place within that cell, so to speak, where you can put urban farmer garden. So we started this project with Chesterfield County, Virginia, and that county is located within Central Virginia. It's just south of the city of Richmond. And right now it is like absolutely rapidly growing and developing. Between 2010 and 2020, the population increased by almost 16%, and it's projected to increase another 8% or so within the next 10 years. And as it begins to rapidly urbanize around, the development border of the city of Richmond and the city of Petersburg, it has a lot of potential to very proactively plan for urban and suburban agriculture, and to attempt to try and conserve some of those spaces so that, the community can have access to these production food spaces and also have it potentially function as green infrastructure. So here are the ULISA variables for Chesterfield County. There were 20 of them, and they were broadly kind of split up into 3 different categories, which include natural and agricultural resources, which is mainly just trying to avoid really important kind of environmental resources, so to speak, that are really beneficial to, they already function as green infrastructure in a way, so we don't want to put farms in those functioning spaces. Like resource protection areas, obviously you can't even put anything in there, but also in the case we're also working with the city of Richmond, we don't want to go into already forested spaces because those are really important green infrastructure elements within the city of Richmond. So we want to kind of balance using, you know, spaces that are already cleared, already, you know, are sort of like empty in some ways. They can be empty, don't have a lot of existing vegetation, so that these spaces don't take away very important, you know, green infrastructure resources already. Then there's also the equity and accessibility category, which goes into food access, accessibility to these resources, also some socioeconomic elements to make sure we really prioritize underserved communities so that they could potentially have these resources first, and, you know, really prioritize these urban farms and gardens being placed in those communities. And then along the lines of green infrastructure, we also included heat island mitigation, which is the processed air temperature, which shows the areas that have the hottest temperatures within the summer. So the overall just hottest temperature that could happen within a given area. So we prioritize placing those within current heat islands within the county. And so this is just kind of a general overview what the model outputs look like. And so it really starts to paint a picture and really show us. It also kind of follows urbanization as well, so that on the development border of the city of Richmond, there's a lot of like really great places, as well as the development border with the city of Petersburg. So there were some very clear patterns that emerged, and it really points us in the right direction of the areas that really kind of need these resources, and where it would have potentially function as green infrastructure as it sits today. So here is a pretty great model application. This was owned, this parcel, these two parcels actually are owned by a development company within Chesterfield, and they had been seeking to rezone these two parcels for about 10 years now. And our kind of regional land conservancy had really been pushing to put this into a conservation easement for at least 5 years, and kind of, you know, was getting a lot of pushback. But then finally, with our model, this was the highest scoring privately owned site. It was finally enough kind of data to convince the owner of these two parcels to actually put it into a conservation easement. And as you can see, these squares are what I was referencing as raster cells, and those really point us in the direction of the best places for urban and suburban agriculture. So this data really has the potential to inform land conservancies and, you know, provide justification for conservation easements and potentially federal funding to fund those conservation easements. And here's another example, kind of very directly applying it to planning principles. This park is called Cogville Park, and it is currently within development. And right now, it is, the first phase is undergoing, and this property is bisected, as you can hopefully see, by a power line, and the urban community garden was placed right within that utility easement. And so our model, that original site was located in pretty suboptimal conditions, specifically the soil conditions, because the majority of this park is a wetland. So we want to obviously avoid those soils, which are aqualts, which are seasonally wet and would be very, very difficult to farm. And so, you know, that initial site was not optimal, but with our model, utilizing the percent suitability raster cells, we were able to convince them to just move the garden site just up a little bit so that it's located within one of our high scoring cells, and would make the site, the garden, much more successful because they are out of those suboptimal soils and out of basically a wetland.
So we're running a little bit ahead of time, which is not the worst thing in the world. So Emily, I think I'm going to just talk off the cuff a little bit here. So Emily, if you can go back 2 slides. So this, as Emily noted, so this is a park that is in development with Chesterfield County, which is the main, one of the 2 governments that we're currently working with. And as part of this park, there is that, as Emily mentioned, the power utility easement that's running through the site. And through our research, that is one area that we're particularly interested in, because some level of basic gardening, maybe not some types of more commercialized agricultural production, but at least community gardening uses can definitely occur on utility easements. And we think that's a great example of what we might think of as as a found space. Everybody think of basically, because of the easements, you can't really do anything underneath the power lines. They basically just have to get mowed. But in a specific situation like this, some ag uses can find those spaces and put them into some sort of productive use beyond just beyond just being the power line, the location where the power lines are going, and then also reduces the mowing cost. I mean, it's not going to be a significant drop, but it does lower the overall maintenance required for those sites, for the maintenance of that easement as well. And so we're excited as we continue to try to work with other governments to see other examples of where there might be found space. I know a few administrators that I've spoken with about this over the years. This has not showed up thus far in our research, but maybe we'll have a good example sometime in the future of other types of found space around a water tower or some other type of public utility infrastructure that requires some boundary space around it that is just kind of having to be mowed. Potentially our analysis might suggest that that could be another good site for a garden or potentially a farm. And so I'm excited to kind of see, as we continue to try to map other communities, where we might find other examples of those kind of found spaces. And I guess I can talk a little bit more about that if people are interested in that. But part of what I think that our job is to suggest to all of you what urban agriculture, both in a commercial sense and a non-commercial sense, could be. And one aspect of that is trying to think a little bit non-traditionally about how we use space for food production. And that could be, if we're thinking about it in an in-ground farming context or gardening context, which is what our analysis is talking about today, that could be gardening under power lines. But also, technology is now allowing for the production of like a hydroponic green production in like shipping containers. And so another one thing I've envisioned, I've never seen this, but you might have multiple, and I don't know if you can see me here on the slide with the presentation here, but you might have multiple shipping containers that have hydroponic production in them underneath a highway overpass potentially. I don't know. I'm sure Department of Transportation might have some issues with that potentially, but that is another example of like a found space where, because of the transportation easement, you can't really do anything else except maybe this. And there's a question that I'm going to respond to. Yeah, so Arlington County, Virginia has contacted us to try to take this research and apply it to either rooftops of buildings, which we think, Emily and I think we probably could do, but Arlington County is really interested in exploring the suitability of the inside of many of their commercial structures and their office structures specifically, because I guess because of changes in the work from home, as the work from home revolution is occurring, Arlington County has a lot of now empty office space and they don't know what to do with. But we're not sure we can do that. I don't really know if we have if all the secondary data sources would exist to allow us to do that mapping in a way that we can speak with any sort of confidence. I love the idea. I just don't know how to do it, but maybe we'll figure it out at some point. And then somebody else said, allowing community gardens So yeah, that's a great question. There is some research out there that some extension scholars at various universities have been working on to try to see how much pollution might be coming into the soil as in like sidewalk and roadway spaces. And I haven't seen anything definitively one way or the other, but I think there are some valid concerns on that point. And so I think that the research needs to kind of continue on that front to kind of say, is there enough pollution, air pollution, that's going to kind of drop into the soil and potentially then be absorbed? Some of it also would depend upon what you're growing as well. Paul asked what common ownership structures for urban ag. So part of what the end of our research here is we're advocating that there needs to be long-term easements on highly suitable sites for urban ag. Think about from a 30 or 50-year perspective as we continue, and this kind of gets into the implication slide. So maybe Emily, go ahead and move to the implication slides. As global climate change continues to disrupt where, say, rice can be produced. You know, how many hectaacres, I don't know, I could look it up, but how many hectaacres of rice agricultural sites in India were lost this year because of the monsoon season, as the monsoons are continuing to get worse in India? I don't know the answer, but it's a lot. And I realize that that is not something necessarily that we as kind of like municipal level planners have much to do with, because that's such a huge global issue. But if all of your communities on this call here started trying to figure out, okay, where are our best ag sites, and then working to try to preserve or conserve those through various, and I know many of you are from different states, so what sort of regulatory windows you could pass through is going to be very different state to state. But how can we, if we can say, what are the best sites in our community, and let's try to make sure that 50 years from now or 100 years from now, those are still the best sites that could be farmed either now or in the future, because ultimately the global food system is going to be disrupted as climate change continues to damage the world. So let me move on. We can come back to these questions at the end here. But so the implications for our work is part of it is related to zoning modernization. Most zoning doesn't really include food production or food or retail sale from like community gardens or from more commercialized forms of urban agriculture. You know, often it's restricted. And so we're kind of advocating, hey, there probably are some regions in the city that our analysis can help suggest that maybe there needs to be some liberalization or increased permissibility around the sale and production of food that's being produced in these sites. And we've already kind of been working with Chesterfield County, the main government that we've been mentioning, to try to change, update their zoning structure and their comprehensive planning around that. Also, by using an empirical tool like our tool, ULISA, but you could probably develop one yourself if you wanted to, or you could work with us. That should help remove potential concerns of arbitrary or capricious action on behalf of the government, because you can say, you know, hey, we collaborated with a research team, we use this empirical method that's been published in peer-reviewed research to determine these are the best sites, we really need to be doing this here. Next slide, Emily. And thanks for the questions, folks. We'll come back to those at the end here. But so, as I said, we've been working with Chesterfield County to kind of update them as our results have come in. They've expressed some interest in updating their comprehensive plan and their parks plan to reflect some of the recommendations that we're making. And then also in the near future, I believe it's next year, they're going to be going through a complete comprehensive zoning update. And we're going to be working with them to try to kind of build in some of our recommendations into that zoning update. And then also I've done a little bit of comparative analysis work for kind of mid-sized cities like Richmond, and you can follow that link there to my research. Go ahead, next slide. And then Emily, I believe that's you.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications for urban gardens and farms and green infrastructure. So urban agriculture has the potential to function as green infrastructure by decreasing ambient temperatures, improving pollution levels. For example, the leaf surface of plants can absorb nitrous oxides, which come from the combustion of fossil fuels from cars. And that is like the precursor to acid rain, and also is a respiratory irritant. So plants can really improve air quality, as well as absorb heat as well and dissipate heat. And it can also potentially mitigate against stormwater issues, particularly trees. They can absorb a great amount of water and help with a lot of urban flooding issues. But unfortunately, many of these urban agriculture sites are majority bare compacted soils, grass, annual plants that are usually in the ground only for about like 5 or 6 months tops. So it doesn't provide, the full potential benefits of green infrastructure to the area because it's kind of bare and it's, all of these annual plants, they're cycling pretty quickly. And so they're not woody as well. So they don't have as much potential to absorb stormwater and help dissipate heat. And so really thinking very proactively about this, mature perennial plants are what are really needed for these spaces to actually function as green infrastructure. And for example, here is a community orchard located in Richmond, and you can see all those little kind of dots are new fruit trees. And so thinking a little bit creatively in, these urban agriculture designs, incorporating trees, incorporating shrubs and bushes will really, really improve the potential for these spaces to, function as green infrastructure and really provide environmental benefits to the surrounding areas. And in particular, native fruit trees and berries are like really important, both for, wildlife, urban wildlife, and urban pollinators, as their habitats are very quickly disappearing, not just in Virginia, but across the globe. So it's really important to consider native plants. A lot of them are perennial, so they'll come back every year and provide those benefits for, at least 15, 20, some native plants even live like 50 years. There's some fruit trees that live that long. So it's really important to consider natives in these plantings. And you can start to think of, they don't just have to be like an oak tree or something like that. They can also, actually produce, an edible harvest. So for example, blackberries are native to Virginia. American persimmons, a lot of people don't realize they are native to Virginia, and actually they're ripening right now. So you can actually maybe find them in some, specialty markets. And then also pawpaws that some people are really starting to learn about. And they are kind of like Virginia's tropical fruit. They are kind of custardy, banana, mango, pineapple flavor. They're really gaining a lot of popularity, and they're really great for wildlife. A lot of turtles and, stuff like animals like that really like them. And it's one of their like native food sources. So thinking with natives is really important. And if you need any more information about native plants, feel free to reach out to me, as that is kind of like my pet project, kind of voicing the importance of including native plants within, agricultural spaces and also just residential design as well.
These are great questions, everybody. Keep throwing them in here. I'm trying to answer some via text as she's talking.
And so just like general future, applications and implications of our research, they provide a localizable, repeatable methodology for urban ag planning. So with each locality, we like tailor it to each locality to make sure that they really have buy-in and that they really get out of the model what they want. So, if they have a particular kind of, if they have a particular like emphasis within the locality on, food access or green infrastructure, we can really focus that within the model. So it really provides a really great tool for those localities to emphasize, some key points that the locality is really interested in. And then generally, the ULISA model has broader implications to obviously be a planning tool for local governments, and also be a pathway for federal agricultural conservation funding that is traditionally, again, for rural spaces. Now we can broaden it into urban spaces. as well as bolstering local food systems, really building out local food systems further to further potential to kind of bolster, our food systems against, potential implications with climate change across, our big industrial global food system. And the ULISA model also is really good at really expanding the potential of green infrastructure. Green infrastructure doesn't just have to be, urban trees or, just a garden. It can be like a food production space. It can, feed the community as well. So there's a lot of potential for these spaces to really help communities and feed communities.
So I think we're going to start, as I've been responding to some of the question or the Q&A in the actual Q&A chat, but now we're kind of done with our formal comments here. So I think we'll just kind of start talking verbally to respond to some of the Q&A questions, but keep bringing them up, folks. We got another 15 minutes or so here. So there was a question from Alex about how gardening is kind of related to longer term food security. I think that's what the question is asking. I would encourage everybody to think that a lot of the research that I've looked at in my conversations with many more kind of like commercial or emerging commercial scale urban farmers is that they're saying they're actually capable of growing and selling a lot more than what they're currently growing, but they don't have anybody to sell to. And so I think a solution for that is moving towards localized buying commitments. So like universities, school districts, basically any organization, any public organization that has a cafeteria, I guess they could be private too. But a public organization with a cafeteria saying we're going to source 3%, 5%, 10% of all the food in our cafeterias to come from a local source. Now, local could mean a lot of different things, but you could say, Euclidean distance 100 miles from the campus or something like that. And the contractors, the purchasing folks would have to work with the food providers to make sure that happens. But ultimately, that sends a buy signal, or that sends a demand signal to the producers. Oh yeah, we could sell to the university. We could grow a whole bunch of broccoli and know that we have somebody to sell it to, as opposed to, well, we grew a whole bunch of broccoli, but then we went to the farmer's market and it rained that day, and then nobody was able to buy it, and so it just went to waste. And so I think that moving towards that institutionalized buying commitment is a way to change the economics at the micro and small scales, to send signals to the producers, hey, you can grow a lot more because we'll buy it. The institutions will buy it. Emily, can you field the second question about sun aspect?
Yeah, let me stop sharing so I can see that.
Okay, yeah, I think you got to click on the Q&A button.
Yeah, so the aspect sun requirement layer comes from USGS. They have it's called 3DEP, 3D elevation product, I believe. So they have that model, so you can see, with the topography where kind of the sun is oriented, and you can, see, the hills, and if it's north facing or south facing and stuff like that. And then, with NGIS, you can also derive the slope from that. So there's a lot of things you can do with the 3DEP from USGS.
That's a really good question. It's a really, really good question. Emily, another one on the native plants. I'm going to defer to you on this one.
Yeah, less pruning. So pawpaws don't, as long as you give them a good amount of space, they don't really need pruning. They just kind of produce on their own. Persimmons, you would need to prune them, just to make sure that they have a healthy canopy. Blackberries, you might want to prune them as well. Let me think on that a little bit further.
So for those of you that are, well, I guess it doesn't matter where you are, but you could always reach out to your university extension officials, especially for those of you that are not in Virginia, depending on where you live. Like I think I saw somebody from Texas, your growth zone is going to be very different from Virginia. And so what native food producing plants might be in Texas are going to be probably quite different in some ways from Virginia here. So contact your university extension. That is going to be a offshoot or a aspect of the land grant of the state. So here in Virginia, it's Virginia Tech and Virginia State, but it's going to vary quite a bit depending on what state you're from. But there's generally 2 of them per state. And extension officials, part of their job is to extend agricultural knowledge. That's quite literally what it means, to extend agricultural knowledge out away from the university towards everybody else in the community. So you can always contact them, and there's going to be somebody at the university there that's going to be an expert in that area, and they can definitely advise you there. Emily, anything else on that you thought of?
Yeah, just really pawpaws are a great one. For some reason, my mind is completely blanking, but if you want to email me, I'm sure I can come up with something right after this presentation. But yeah, definitely a lot of potential within, urban or native edible plants within production. Some of them are a little bit higher maintenance if you want to like make sure that they're more manageable and healthy, but there are some that you can kind of let go.
And then to Alan's question around, does rooftop gardens count for LED points or some other way to make stormwater regulations as far as green roofs go rather? I suspect that's the case, but honestly I don't really deal with LEED at all. But I do suspect that it probably would work, probably kind of by default. I don't think that that's necessarily programmed into LEED, but I very well could be mistaken. If anybody knows, please put that in the chat. But I suspect that might be like a kind of a shoehorned in kind of thing, that having a garden is effectively a way of trapping rainwater at a sufficient level that probably would count for that particular checkbox of LEED. And that's a pretty innovative way of approaching something like this. And honestly, yeah, folks, I really see that's a direction that I think we have to be going in as when we're thinking about the design of new buildings in the kind of 50-year trajectory as climate change continues to be create oppressive amounts of heat. I don't know how valid this is, but I remember seeing some CNN article, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago saying this was the hottest summer on record for the whole country ever, like a composite for the whole US. And I suspect that that's probably going to continue. And so it's incumbent upon us as planners to be thinking about from a multidimensional spectrum of how are we planning our buildings that can also be planning for green infrastructure, that can also be planning for our food systems. And that's a very open-ended question that I have for you. Emily and I, we have a little bit of the answers to some of this, but there are lots of other folks in positions vaguely like us at universities across the country that I'm sure that they would love to talk with you all about how we can incorporate this more in the design of our cities over the next like 50 to 100 years, because climate change isn't going anywhere, unfortunately. Anonymous, let's see here. Great question. So how much, at least in my experience, is local governments interested in economic development and or workforce development related to urban ag? I think that it's a curiosity in most cases. I think it's well, this is probably something we could do, but is it creating living wage jobs? And is it not getting in the way of other forms of development? And Emily didn't mention this, but in our model, at least for Chesterfield County, and this is a little bit different for what we're doing for the city of Richmond, because we're mapping the city of Richmond right now, but biasing away from targeted areas of development. So like we're looking at the comp plan and we're saying, okay, hey, the jurisdiction thinks that, there's going to be development going on in this area, more specifically, we want apartments here. Okay, great. The government wants apartments there. We're going to bias away from that within the geospatial model to say, okay, great. Apartments are going to go in this little narrow strip. Let's stay away from that. And that's not the only factor, obviously. It's a multivariable analysis. But I think avoiding areas of targeted development is important. But kind of to the larger point, I think urban ag in a lot of ways is a curiosity. And I published another article, and I'll track this down and I'll send it out to the chat here in a second. I'll let Emily field another question that talks about this a little bit. But as an open-ended question to all of you, Emily and I could come back if you all were interested, and we could do a little bit more of a presentation that's focused on just what are the different forms of urban ag, both from like a commercial and non-commercial perspective, and what sort of land uses do they engage in? Because I think on some level, and tell me in the chat if you don't know, but on some level, I have to imagine many of you are interested but a little bit confused about what this maybe could be. What does it look like? What forms does it have? What forms does it not have? What spaces can it utilize? What spaces can it utilize? That's a question that I keep running into when I'm talking to officials, but I don't know, there's a lot of you here, so if you've got thoughts, put them in the chat, and then I'll try to find that article. Emily, can you take the next question?
Yeah, the next question is broadly about, contaminants in soil and contaminants coming in from roadways. So there was a good study from Virginia Tech a few years ago that found that vegetables and, harvestable products in kind of quote unquote contaminated soils, the plants themselves don't uptake those contaminants. It's just the soil surface has them. So, the soil that is on the vegetables have those contaminants. So you have to be very proactive with cleaning procedures for your produce and stuff like that to remove those contaminants. So it's not about, the carrot, has lead in it. It's the soil that's on the carrot when you harvest it has lead in it. So you have to be very careful about those practices. But in terms of like soils aggregating pollution from roadways and stuff, there's new kind of developments and research on that. It's not extremely clear right now, how much pollution is, coming into those spaces and getting on that produce. But it's really great within urban gardens to buffer those, spaces that are right off of roads. So like planting some sort of nice bush or like hedgerow kind of to buffer that like immediate pollution just going straight to your produce, giving it a little bit of space and a plant buffer between to make sure that that pollution doesn't just like automatically just like go straight onto, the soil surface and on your plants.
Emily, I think that's a you question from Ben Holt there.
How do localities handle harvest, distribution, use for native food plants? So it's a little bit tricky for some of them. For example, pawpaws, they're very fragile. They bruise very easily. So a lot of places, especially farmers markets, like the farmers know that they've created, the customer base to like know that they can, sell them, and it's worth that extra effort to like very safely distribute them to the farmers market so that their consumers can have them. So it's really about like building, the consumer base for a lot of these products. Some of them are like a little bit funky and people don't know about them. So it's really education. And then, once you have your defined customer base, very gently, in a lot of cases, getting it to them. Also, like persimmons, they are also like very fragile. They're like a very kind of like jelly soft fruit. So it requires a little bit more care with handling and distributing those elements. So right now, it's really just kind of like specialty produce places or farms, particularly at farmers markets, that know that they have the customer base. And so they take those extra precautions.
That's a great question. And as I mentioned this slightly before, but as kind of a broader open-ended comment to all of you, part of Emily and I's jobs as food system researchers is to try to pass information about what's going on kind of currently within this system, within this space. And so if you want to hear more from us on a certain subtopic, maybe there's something you heard today that you'd like to learn a little bit more about, definitely contact Jillian and the APA folks here, and we could definitely do another one of these. So just, reach out to us or reach out to the APA people, and we can get something like that's scheduled. If there's a topic you want to narrow in down a little bit more on, we can definitely do that. And, if you got more questions, keep them coming here. I guess I'll also say, kind of as we're moving towards a close, that Emily and I, so we're mapping the city of Richmond right now, and then after that, we're looking for other communities, broadly in the state of Virginia, but honestly, because of telework, we could really do anywhere in the country, because I know there's people from Texas and everywhere else. If you're interested in collaborating with us on trying to get your community mapped using our method here, we'd be happy to try to chat with you. Just reach out to us separately, and we can definitely discuss trying to make that happen. But we definitely would like to see other communities across the country using our method here, as we think that this is really important, obviously, and so that's why we're here talking about it today. Oh, there's another one in the chat. Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, John.
Oh.
I do see that we have a few questions coming in and we do have time. I just wanted to say if, there are some other questions, if we're trying to fill the last few minutes, if you maybe wanted to touch on some of the answers that you answered in the chat regarding
that's probably a good idea.
structures, if you think it's applicable to the whole audience, but I have seen a few more questions come in.
Emily, you want to field one of these and I'll look through the ones I answered in the chat?
Sure.
How do I even do that? Okay.
So someone recently talked to someone at NRCS and they said that they are moving away from the term urban ag because no one really knows what it means, which makes sense. And they're moving into small scale ag, calling that small scale ag. What are our thoughts on that?
Urban ag can mean so many different things. And like, that's one, we could probably do a whole presentation just talking about what are the different forms of urban ag and what sort of spaces do they use and what sort of technology that they use. And is there, I'm unaware of a better term. I think it's probably a small micro scale or whatever they said. That could apply in a rural context too. So I don't know if I necessarily like that any better or worse. But I think that the how it is done in an urban context is very different from how it's done in a rural context. If you think of hydroponic production, say in an old industrial space, you get three-dimensional scale there where you just can't have that in a rural space. That's not how land works. Land is generally two-dimensional, at least in this context. And so it is a different form of agriculture. There was a question from Paul some time ago about common ownership structures. As I kind of mentioned before, I think long-term easements held by land trusts and or governments are probably the best long-term strategy. And by long-term, I mean, multi-decade strategy here. Those easement holders could engage in long-term leases, think like 5-ish years at the minimum, with a farmer or a gardener to give access to the site. And I think that those long-term leases are important. I think that there's some really good research out there, both that I've done and then other scholars have done, saying that, like there's examples of like 6-month-long leases or year-long leases. That doesn't give the farmers or gardeners any confidence that they're going to have that land from a multi-year perspective. And so it prevents them from investing in the infrastructure at the site. And if they don't have the infrastructure at the site, then it's often hard for them to be as productive as they possibly could, which then leads to perceptions of, oh, well, you can't be economically viable, or, oh, it's not producing enough. Well, no, they don't have confidence that they can invest in the site to build the infrastructure that they need to really be as successful as they can be. So I think those long-term leases are really important. And I think that long-term easements are really the way to go, because if you have the best sites identified, they should stay the best sites and not put any other use there. There's lots of places apartments can go and lots of places commercial buildings can go, but there's not that many sites that are really capable of producing food at any sort of significantly sustainable scale. Emily, you want to field another one?
Could you
just go back and forth?
Do you discuss some more examples of updating comp plans to include food system recommendations?
So we're in the process of working with Chesterfield on that. That's kind of an ongoing process with them. So we really haven't had a chance to really write anything about it kind of in a public sense. And then that's kind of still an ongoing process with them. So I don't know how much we can necessarily talk about at this point, unfortunately. Maybe, and Emily, I think this is a good idea, maybe in like a year-ish or so when we're done with Chesterfield, maybe we could do like a joint presentation between like us and them and talk about how they incorporated our recommendations into the plan. I think that probably would be a good idea. But right now, I don't really concrete details I can really give you right now, unfortunately, because it's an ongoing process. Emily, you got anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, we have just really been talking with them about language and kind of the requirements of urban ag to try and make, their ordinances a little bit more friendly towards those activities. So like John mentioned, it's an ongoing process, and we're using our expertise to help them kind of form the language that would make urban agriculture, more successful within the counties, specifically mostly in residential areas, making it much more friendly in those spaces.
There was a question about production in utility easements, but there was some concerns about, if you're digging into the ground, could you hit like a natural gas pipeline? The answer is yes, you obviously could hit a natural gas pipeline. So you probably want to be very careful about something like that. But that assumes that you're digging into the ground. not every form of urban agriculture requires you to dig into the ground. Presumably, most people have probably heard of like raised bed gardening. Like that's not necessarily the most productive way of doing it, at least from my perspective, but that's definitely something you can do. And in that case, you're not digging into the ground at all. You're bringing in soil artificially from outside, and you're kind of getting a little bit of verticality off of the soil horizon. So you're never going under the ground where you might potentially hit a gas line or something else that you might want to damage. Now, you would want to bring some water infrastructure into that site. So you'd want to install, a tap, but you'd obviously have to talk to the utility commission to make sure that you're putting in, when you put the water line in, you're not going to hit the gas line that might be going through the site. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense. Emily, you want to field one? I got most of the ones that were text-based.
What is a good resource to learn more about indoor vertical farming?
That is a great question. Shoot me an email and I'll find you some resources. I can't rattle anything off the top of my head. But I can, a lot of it is unfortunately proprietary knowledge. A lot of the businesses that I'm aware of are doing this. They're very, very close-lipped about how productive it is, what sort of energy or material input uses that they're engaging in, what's their profitability like. Sometimes they report what they pay their workers, but sometimes not. There's some concerns that that they could be taking advantage of economic development programs that are given to them and not actually delivering on the promised job creation. I'm skeptical of some of those promises. I can't speak with any sort of certainty, obviously, but these are just things that I hear. But a lot of that is unfortunately very proprietary, and nobody really wants to talk about it for somewhat obvious reasons. But that leaves a challenge for us of like, how can we suggest these are good ideas or not if we don't really know how effective it is?
Yeah, and I worked on an indoor vertical farm. It was soil-based instead of hydroponic. And yeah, every single step of the process was extremely hush-hush, very proprietary, not sharing any information with any outside sources. So unfortunately, that space is extremely locked down right now in terms of those resources. There's not very many open source kind of information or how to build something like that out there.
During my dissertation process, I had to call one of the city planners to track down where a hydroponic business was even located. I couldn't even get them to tell me where their physical address was. So I called a planner and they told me. So I was able to put it on the map that I eventually created. But they wouldn't even tell me where they were physically located. There are more questions? I think we got most of them. Thanks, everybody. This was great. Those are wonderful questions, all. Wonderful questions.
I'm sorry to have to cut us off, but we're at 1:02. So we're going to have to go ahead and end this webinar, but we really appreciate all of your questions. And I think the engagement from our attendees really reflects how great of a presentation it was. So thank you, Emily and John. Contact information for you both will be going out to attendees. So if you have follow-up questions or something that comes to mind that you didn't think of today, that will be an opportunity. And I will also be sending out the webinar recording and the presentation slide deck. But thank you everyone for joining us, and stay tuned for more webinars with APA Virginia. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.